So if you're recently engaged, one of the main questions that you have is, how much is my wedding going to cost and what is the budget going to be? Well, the answer is really a tricky one, and today I'm going to help explain that just a little bit. Hi friends, I'm Joshua. I am a wedding filmmaker here in Virginia, and I'm going for a walk in my neighborhood. So let's talk about wedding budgets for just a few minutes, shall we? When you're first getting married, you probably don't know anything about weddings. You probably don't have a clue, and you're probably wondering yourself, how am I going to afford such an expensive wedding? Well, I can tell you that one of the things that couples do that's a pretty big mistake is that they simply ask. They go, hey, how much was your wedding? Hey, how much does the reception cost? How much does your venue cost? And while those are good questions to ask, it's not the right question to ask. And let me explain why. When you're getting married, it's a lot like buying an automobile or a house. And the problem is, not everyone can afford the house that you have. Not everyone can afford the house that the neighbor has, or the fancy car. You know, some people can't afford a Mercedes-Benz or a BMW. They have to settle for a Honda or Toyota, which is honestly equally as fine in today's age of technology. However, I can tell you that that is the biggest mistake that couples make is, well, how much does it cost to have a wedding? Well, if you look at the national average online, you go to The Knot or Wedding Wire, they're going to tell you that it's about $34,000 to $35,000, $36,000, which honestly is a lot of money, especially in this day and age. When I first entered into the wedding videography business in the late 90s, the average wedding was just under $20,000, which is still a lot of money in today's world. But in the last 20 years, it's jumped up $15,000. So the question begs, how do you figure out how to have the right kind of budget? Well, the answer honestly lies within your own realm, so to speak. It has to do with how much debt you're in, how much money you make, how much you ultimately want to spend on your wedding. Because here's the truth. The truth is, there is no right way or wrong way to have a wedding, and there's no standard that says you got to spend $30,000 to have a good wedding to begin with. So what's interesting is that most couples in my area here in Virginia spend about $20,000 to $25,000 instead of the $30,000 to $35,000 that a lot of people think that you should spend. Hold on a second, I'm going to turn around here. I'm at the end of the cul-de-sac. So one of the questions you need to ask yourself is it important to have a large wedding? And the answer is no, it's really not. Although some people will say, well, it's somewhat important to me. And that's perfectly fine. But it's something that you need to ask yourself, because the more guests you have, the more expensive the wedding is going to be. So that average, that national average, is based on 120 guests, which is a lot of guests. The truth is, most people don't really know 120 people very well. And if you do, it's mostly family, to be honest with you. But people like to keep up with the Joneses. They like to have that status quo, and they want to feel like $1 million when they get married. Trust me, I know, I've been married more than once. So, what you need to do is, number one, you need to look at your debt. How much debt do you have? How much debt does the spouse-to-be have? If you've got a large amount of debt, I do not recommend getting a loan. I don't recommend putting wedding stuff on your credit card. What I do recommend is getting a part-time job and paying for the wedding yourself out of your own pocket. If you're in a lot of debt, then you should really take a long period of time to have the engagement. That way you can take that amount of time to work and chip away at all the vendors, the venue, the guest list, and everything else that you need to. Now, I know a lot of you couples out there are probably not looking for that as an answer. But the truth is, if you can get married and not go into any more debt, you're ahead of the game. And that's something that I highly recommend. In fact, one of the things that I do recommend is that you should work with vendors like myself that offer monthly payments. Here at Wedding Photography and Films, for example, Carol and I offer a monthly payment program where you tell us how much you want to pay a month and you tell us the deposit amount, 10 to 50%. So you're more in control of what you're going to do with the finances. The great thing about that is it helps chip away and eat away at the debt for the wedding without having to fork out huge amounts of money up front. The other problem that couples tend to face is, well, how much income do I truly have? The problem with that is when they ask the neighbor or the person up the street, hey, how much did your wedding cost? And they say, oh, I spent $25,000. The reality is they might be making a lot more money than you. And while that's great and dandy, whoops, crossing the street, while that's great and dandy and all, the reality is that you might not be able to afford a $25,000 wedding. Maybe you can only afford a $15,000 wedding. Or maybe you make $200,000 a year and $20,000 is a drop in the bucket. My point is, everyone is different when it comes to weddings. There's no standard. There's no right way or wrong way to have a wedding. You don't need a big one and you don't need a small one. I guess the reality is that there's no definitive answer on how much should you spend for the wedding. Ooh, let's turn around here. But what I can tell you is that instead of looking outside the box, you need to have a hard look at your finances and see if you can really afford the wedding that you'd ultimately like to have. I'll give you a couple of tidbits, and it's something I talk about on the blog on a regular basis. The number one expense is actually the guests. It's not the venue. People think, oh, the venue is the most expensive thing. And it is expensive, but it's usually number two in line. What I can tell you is that the more guests you have at the wedding, the more the wedding is going to cost you. It's because you have to buy the food, you have to buy the alcohol, the tables, the chairs, the linens, the rentals, a DJ, photographers like me, videographers like me. But the reality is, guests are the number one most expensive, followed by the venue, and typically the photographer is third, and so forth and so forth. I will be honest with you, I've done weddings that literally have cost $140,000 here in the Roanoke Valley. And they're beautiful weddings. I mean, they spent more money on flowers, for example, that I could shake a stick at. Probably more than what my Nissan Armada's worth, to be honest with you. But those weddings didn't last very long. And I've done backyard barbecue weddings that, you know, might have cost $3,000 or $4,000 tops. And those are some of the best weddings I've ever been to. So realistically, what you need to do is you need to sit down, have a real conversation with your soon-to-be spouse, and figure it out. I'd really like to know what you guys think about wedding budgets and what you've come up with. I'm sure that you guys have some numbers in mind that you've already decided upon. I'd love to hear from you. Oh man, it's a hot one out here today. I really appreciate the company today, and hopefully we'll talk to you soon. Thanks.